It's not rare, it's not eternal, and it was never meant to be a symbol of love. For centuries, we've been told a story, elegant, polished, untouchable. A story that begins with a sparkle and ends with a purchase. You've heard the lines, "Diamonds are forever." They're the ultimate gesture, proof of devotion, proof of success, a ritual sealed in velvet and champagne. Maybe you proposed with one, maybe you received one, maybe you believed it meant forever. That's how good the illusion is. But what if none of it was real? What if the sparkle you've been chasing is just the reflection of a well-crafted deception? Because diamonds, they weren't always symbols of love. They were once buried in the riverbeds of India, unknown to the Western world. Then hoarded by kings, worn by empires, used not as romance, but as dominance. And then came the mines. In the late 1800s, diamonds were discovered in the rocks of South Africa. The world didn't get richer, a few men did. They didn't find treasure, they found control. Control over land, labor, and perception. So they created a myth, scarcity. Not because diamonds were rare, but because they had to look rare. And it worked. They formed a cartel. They bought the mines. They destroyed the competition. They burned excess inventory. They orchestrated global supply like puppet masters pulling invisible strings. But then they did something more powerful. They went after your heart. In 1938, a collapsing diamond empire made a final move. It hired an ad agency, but not to advertise diamonds, to rewrite emotion, to turn rocks into rituals. Diamonds are forever. 4 words that changed how we marry, how we measure love, how we value devotion. And just like that, they didn't sell gems, they sold status, dreams, fear of being unloved. A diamond isn't just a stone, it's a message. You matter, you're chosen, you belong. Even if the cost is 2 months of your life, even if its resale value is near zero, even if, in Sierra Leone, a boy once risked his life for a diamond sold for $20,000 in New York, labeled as ethical. Because for every velvet box opened in joy, there's another deal sealed in silence, a war funded in shadows, a truth buried beneath billions in marketing. And people don't buy reality, they buy belief. And belief, when repeated across generations, becomes truth. But now, the truth is cracking. Lab-grown diamonds are rising. Gen Z is questioning everything. The truly wealthy are chasing rarer trophies. And behind the sparkle, something darker begins to show. This isn't just about jewelry. This is about power, about illusion, about what we're told to worship and what we're too afraid to let go. You're about to see how one of the most cherished traditions in the world was engineered from scarcity, cemented by manipulation, and passed down as gospel. You're not supposed to know this, but once you do, the shine will never look the same. After this, the way you see value and love may never be the same. This is the diamond illusion, how an ancient lie became luxury's greatest trick. Before it became a symbol of eternal love, before it adorned engagement rings in velvet-lit showrooms, the diamond was something else entirely. It was a stone, hard, brilliant, and misunderstood. For most of history, diamonds were neither common nor desired. They existed quietly in the riverbeds of India, where they were first discovered as early as the 4th century BCE. Collected not for beauty, but for spiritual significance. Believed to ward off evil, used in religious rituals, reserved only for kings and gods. For 2,000 years, India was the world's only known source of diamonds. And in that solitude, the legend began. But the diamond's first real transformation came not from its sparkle, but from its symbolism. By the late Middle Ages, European royalty began to adopt diamonds not as decoration, but as declaration of power, of divine right, of immortality. These weren't engagement gifts, they were weapons of status. The kings of France, the dukes of Burgundy, the monarchs of the Habsburg dynasty, they wore diamonds like armor. The harder the stone, the stronger the image. A diamond didn't whisper love, it shouted dominance. But even then, diamonds remained rare, limited by geography, a luxury only because supply was microscopic. And then came the volcanic crack that changed everything. In 1867, in a dry region of South Africa called Kimberley, a boy named Erasmus Jacobs picked up a shiny rock along the Orange River. That rock, later identified as a 21-carat diamond, triggered the greatest diamond rush the world had ever seen. By 1871, thousands of diggers descended on Kimberley. Within a few years, the first major mine, the Big Hole, had been carved entirely by hand. 16,000 men, pickaxes and shovels, digging the earth raw. And suddenly, diamonds weren't so rare anymore. By 1880, the output of South African mines dwarfed all previous global supply. The myth of scarcity was collapsing under the weight of geological truth. And that posed a serious problem. Because if diamonds were no longer rare, they were no longer valuable. Enter a man named Cecil Rhodes, a British imperialist with a vision not just to mine diamonds, but to monopolize them. Rhodes founded a company called De Beers, named after the Dutch farmers who owned the land where diamonds had been discovered. But De Beers wasn't built to dig. It was built to dominate. By the 1890s, Rhodes had bought up almost every diamond mine in South Africa. He controlled production, transportation, labor. He negotiated secret deals with British banks. He used colonial power to suppress uprisings, secure land, and ensure that no other company could compete. And he did it with one principle: control the supply, and you control the price. So he started withholding diamonds from the market, stockpiling them, burning inventory, flooding supply chains only when prices needed to be corrected. De Beers didn't just sell diamonds, it engineered value. And it did so with religious precision. By the early 20th century, De Beers controlled over 90% of the world's diamond trade, not just in Africa, but through distribution networks in London, New York, Antwerp. The myth of scarcity had been resurrected. But this time, it wasn't natural. It was industrial. Diamonds had become a managed illusion. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, it's just beginning. Because controlling the stone wasn't enough. To truly conquer the world, De Beers needed to control the story. And that was the next move. By the dawn of the 20th century, diamonds had exploded from obscurity into a global trade, but not because they were beautiful, because one man, and later one company, understood something no one else did. Value could be manufactured. Cecil Rhodes wasn't just a businessman, he was a strategist of empire. While other miners sold what they dug, Rhodes quietly bought up their operations. His vision wasn't to flood the market, it was to own it. In 1888, he consolidated control under a single name, De Beers Consolidated Mines. But De Beers was more than a mining company. It was a shadow empire, a machine that controlled not just how diamonds were dug, but if they ever saw the light of day. Rhodes understood the threat, More diamonds meant less value. The myth of rarity was fragile, so he acted decisively. De Beers stockpiled diamonds in vaults. It burned excess inventory. It flooded the market to punish competitors and then vanished stones to drive prices up again. And it didn't stop at the mines. De Beers infiltrated every level of the supply chain, from African soil to London sorting houses, from European cutters to New York retailers. The flow of diamonds moved only if De Beers allowed it. They didn't just dominate production, they engineered perception. They established the Central Selling Organization in London, a front that gave the illusion of a market while hiding a single-channel monopoly. Anyone who wanted to sell diamonds had to go through De Beers, and anyone who defied them was crushed. Jewelry stores who undercut prices were blacklisted. Nations that tried to break away were politically isolated. Even governments bowed to De Beers' pressure. This wasn't capitalism. It was a cartel, arguably the most successful one the world has ever seen. But by the 1930s, even the cartel faced a crisis. The Great Depression had decimated luxury markets. Americans had stopped buying diamonds altogether. De Beers had vaults full of product and no one to sell them to. That's when they turned to a new kind of weapon. Not logistics, not suppression, but psychology. De Beers hired the Philadelphia-based ad agency N.W. Iyer, not to promote diamonds, but to embed them into culture, into emotion, into identity. It wasn't just a campaign, it was a reprogramming. The brief was simple: make diamonds inseparable from love. Not optional, not aspirational, essential. And it worked. They launched one of the most insidious campaigns in advertising history. They placed diamonds on the fingers of Hollywood actresses. They scripted lines for movie dialogue. They seeded stories in newspapers about proper proposals. They invented the 2-month salary rule, a number pulled from thin air, cemented in guilt and performance. And in 1947, they coined the phrase that would change human behavior forever. A diamond is forever. It wasn't a slogan, it was a spell. Sales skyrocketed. In less than 2 decades, diamond engagement rings became a global norm, not through demand, but through design. A ritual implanted in millions of minds, repeating generation after generation. And behind it all, De Beers controlled the faucet. When supply needed tightening, they turned it off. When markets showed resistance, they flooded them with low-grade stones. When new producers tried to enter the game, De Beers bought them out or cut them off. The company even developed fake independent traders to simulate competition. In reality, all roads still led back to the cartel. But perhaps the most chilling part was how silent it all remained. There were no exposés, no protests, no documentaries. Because no one questioned love. No one questioned forever. And De Beers knew it. They weren't selling diamonds, they were selling certainty. In a chaotic world full of broken promises and uncertain futures, they offered a symbol you could hold in your hand. Indestructible, sparkling, eternal. It didn't matter that resale values were dismal. It didn't matter that diamonds weren't actually scarce. What mattered was belief. De Beers turned carbon into conviction, and the world followed blindly. But by the late 1930s, De Beers had stockpiles of diamonds buried in vaults and a crisis on its hands. The world economy was reeling. The United States, their most critical untapped market, simply didn't care about diamonds. Engagement rings weren't tradition. They were niche, optional, often replaced by practical gifts, a washing machine, a vacation, or nothing at all. To Americans, diamonds didn't mean love. They meant nothing. And De Beers couldn't let that stand. So they hired an ad agency. But not just any agency. N.W. Ayer, a Philadelphia firm that understood something deeper than demographics, desire. De Beers' brief was simple and sinister. Create a cultural norm. Make diamonds emotionally mandatory. N.W. Ayer's strategy wasn't to advertise diamonds, it was to engineer meaning. They didn't run sales, they didn't push promotions, they planted ideas. In magazines, in movies, in classrooms. They scripted stories in newspapers about ideal proposals. They placed diamonds in celebrity engagements, not as accessories, but as statements, a sign of success, maturity, real love. And slowly, something changed. What had been a commodity of the wealthy became a dream of the masses. What had been meaningless became sacred. By the early 1940s, engagement rings with diamonds had tripled in the U.S. Then came 1947. A copywriter named Frances Giretti, working late, scrawled 4 words into a campaign memo. She didn't think much of it, but her line would soon become the most effective piece of emotional conditioning in modern history. A diamond is forever. It wasn't just brilliant, it was unbreakable. The line did something no marketing slogan had ever done. It fused a physical object with an abstract ideal: permanence, devotion, legacy, death. A diamond wasn't just hard, it was forever. And if your love was real, it had to be too. The phrase was so powerful, it became law. Not legal law, cultural law. By the 1950s, nearly 80% of American brides were receiving diamond engagement rings. By the 1960s, the 2-month salary rule was born, not from any economic theory, but a quiet suggestion in an ad campaign. Isn't 2 months of salary a small price to pay for a lifetime of love? No one asked who came up with it. No one asked where it came from, because the idea had already sunk in. And here's the genius and the cruelty of it all. Diamonds don't retain value. They aren't rare. They aren't even unique anymore. But they are charged with expectation, with status, with emotional blackmail. A man who doesn't buy a diamond, he's cheap. A woman who questions the ritual, she's cold. It wasn't marketing, it was hypnosis. De Beers didn't just colonize the minds, they colonized the mind. And their success didn't stop in America. N.W. Ayer took the blueprint global. In Japan, where Western-style weddings were rare, De Beers launched an intensive 20-year campaign. They used TV, billboards, bridal magazines. In 1967, fewer than 5% of Japanese brides received diamond rings. By 1981, over 60%. Same playbook, same result. Cultural implantation disguised as tradition. They expanded to Brazil, China, Russia, reshaping entire economies through a single symbol. And the brilliance of it all? It was invisible. Because people weren't repeating a brand, they were repeating meaning. A diamond is forever became more than a tagline. It became a belief. So effective that even now, in a digital age, when people question institutions, banks, governments, almost no one questions the diamond. It still sells, it still stuns, it still seals the deal. And that's by design. Because the true brilliance of the diamond isn't in its sparkle, it's in the silence that surrounds it. No one asked how the stone got there. No one asked what it cost, not in dollars, but in suffering. No one asked who decided it was love. Because the illusion was so complete, it didn't feel like advertising. It felt like destiny. But the next generation is starting to blink. Not just because of ethics, not just because of cost. Every diamond shines, but not every diamond is clean. While De Beers polished the image of love in the West, a darker reality was unfolding, thousands of miles away, in regions the marketing never showed. Africa, the continent that gave birth to the modern diamond empire, was bleeding. The mines that supplied engagement rings and anniversary gifts were also fueling something else: war. In countries like Sierra Leone, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, diamonds weren't symbols of love. They were currency for terror. Warlords discovered what De Beers had always known. Diamonds are compact, high value, untraceable. They don't beep at borders, they don't rot, and in conflict zones, they're as valuable as guns. So they mined them, by force, at gunpoint, with child labor, with mutilation, with death. Entire villages were enslaved to extract stones. Men were killed, women were assaulted, children lost limbs for resisting. The profits? Used to fund rebel armies, to buy weapons, to overthrow governments. The world would come to know them by a chilling name: blood diamonds. But for years, that term didn't exist. The stones flowed freely into international markets, mixed with legitimate supply. They reached the hands of traders in Antwerp, cutters in Tel Aviv, retailers in New York, and no one asked. Because to question where a diamond came from was to risk shattering the illusion. De Beers publicly denied involvement, claiming to avoid conflict zones. But their control had slipped. By the late 1990s, other players had entered the market. Black markets flourished, cartels fractured. Diamonds once tightly controlled were now scattered across battlefields and still finding their way to ring fingers. In 2000, a global outcry began. Activists, journalists, and survivors brought the truth to light. The United Nations estimated that up to 15% of global diamond trade at the time was funding armed conflict. The response? The Kimberley process, a certification scheme meant to guarantee that diamonds were conflict-free. But the loopholes were enormous. Countries certified their own exports. Corruption ran rampant. Blood diamonds were laundered through neighboring states, relabeled and resold. To the consumer, it was invisible. To the rebel, it was business as usual. In 2006, the Hollywood film Blood Diamond put the issue on the mainstream radar. Leonardo DiCaprio played a smuggler. The tagline said it all: "It will cost you everything." And for many, it did. The diamond that sits quietly in a display case, gleaming, innocent, pure, may have passed through a warlord's hand, may have been pried from the earth by a boy with no name, may have traveled under moonlight in a rebel's pocket, bought bullets, bought silence, bought death. And no amount of marketing can clean that. Because the truth is simple. A diamond is just a stone, but the story we attach to it carries weight. And sometimes that weight is unbearable. For a stone that symbolizes love, too many people have died. For over a century, the diamond cartel controlled everything: the mines, the narrative, the meaning. But then, science intervened. In the shadows of the luxury world, a quiet revolution was brewing. One that didn't involve pickaxes or politics, but plasma chambers and carbon atoms. Lab-grown diamonds, identical in composition, indistinguishable to the naked eye, born not in the Earth's crust, but in controlled environments, using either high-pressure, high-temperature, or chemical vapor deposition techniques. And the result? A diamond. Real, pure, molecularly perfect. But for the traditional industry, it was a threat of existential proportions. Because if you could grow a diamond, what exactly were you paying for? The implications were devastating. No more wars, no more mines, no more cartel, and no more illusion of rarity. At first, De Beers laughed it off, dismissed lab diamonds as synthetic, inferior, unromantic. They claimed real love required a real diamond, meaning, of course, one pulled from the earth at great cost. But the science kept advancing. By the early 2010s, lab-grown diamonds had gone from novelty to commodity. Prices dropped, clarity improved, and the new generation, digital natives, climate-conscious, economically cautious, began asking dangerous questions. Why pay a fortune for something created under slave-like conditions when the same thing can be made ethically, cleanly, affordably? The old answers no longer worked, and De Beers knew it. So in 2018, in a move that stunned the industry, De Beers launched its own lab-grown diamond brand, Lightbox. But it came with a catch. They priced the stones cheaply, too cheaply. $800 for a 1-carat diamond, a fraction of what the same product cost from competitors. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. These are not for engagement. They're fashion, costume, disposable. It wasn't an embrace. It was a containment strategy. By undercutting the market, De Beers hoped to delegitimize it, to keep lab-grown diamonds out of the one place they feared most, the proposal. But it didn't work, because the younger generation wasn't looking for validation from tradition. They were looking for transparency, ethics, intelligence, independence. And lab-grown diamonds offered all of it. No blood, no mines, no carbon footprint, no centuries of propaganda. By 2023, the shift had begun. Lab-grown diamonds accounted for over half of all engagement rings sold in the United States. The myth of eternal scarcity was cracking, and so was the narrative. For decades, the diamond industry had sold the idea that value came from the earth, from depth, from difficulty, from the illusion of sacrifice. But now, value was being redefined, not by geology, but by choice. To the traditionalist, this was blasphemy. To the cartel, it was insurrection. But to the emerging buyer, Gen Z, millennials, independents, it was freedom. A diamond no longer needed to be a status symbol. It could be a decision. And that made it powerful in a whole new way. Because when science threatens power, tradition strikes back. Which raises a question the old industry doesn't want you to ask. If the stone is the same, what exactly were you ever paying for? For something so expensive, diamonds behave in a strangely uncooperative way. You buy them at a premium. You're told they're an investment, a treasure, a legacy, a store of wealth. But try selling one. Walk into a jeweler with your engagement ring and ask for a buyback. What you'll hear, if they even make you an offer, will be a fraction of the original price. Sometimes 30%, sometimes less. Often nothing. Why? Because diamonds were never meant to be sold back. They were engineered to be bought and held. And here lies the genius and the cruelty of the system. De Beers knew that a diamond's greatest enemy wasn't synthetic copies or economic downturns. It was the second-hand market. If people started reselling diamonds, supply would spike, prices would drop. The illusion of scarcity would dissolve. So they crushed the resale market before it was born. For decades, the industry refused to buy back stones. Retailers offered no liquidity. Wholesalers only dealt with new inventory. And the narrative was carefully controlled. Diamonds are not for profit, they're for love. It was the perfect trap. A product that cost thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, but behaved like a consumable, a symbol of eternity that depreciated instantly. Compare that to gold, to art, to classic watches or rare wine. Those markets have real scarcity, real collectors, real secondary demand. Diamonds? They have emotion. But emotion doesn't hold its price. And that's by design. Consider this. Unlike most luxury assets, the value of a diamond is determined by certifiers. Institutions like the Gemological Institute of America, GIA, which assign grades based on clarity, cut, color, and carat. But these grades aren't absolute. They're subjective. And the certifiers are part of the ecosystem they grade. It's like letting the casino write the rule book and calling it fairness. The average consumer doesn't know how to evaluate a diamond. They trust the certificate. They trust the store. They trust the tradition. But none of it protects their money. Because diamonds don't behave like assets. They behave like narratives. Once you remove the story, the ad, the box, the proposal, you're left with a rock. A beautiful one, perhaps, but not a liquid one. Even auctions shy away from non-rare diamonds. Unless the stone has historical significance or is truly exceptional in size, it's just another sparkle in an ocean of sparkle. This is the truth the industry doesn't whisper. It shouts love, but it hides loss. And the loss is quiet, private, undiscussed. No one posts the resale value of their ring on Instagram. No one brags about the diamond they sold at a 60% loss. Because the illusion isn't just economic, it's social. To question the value of a diamond is to question the moment it represented, the love, the status, the promise. And who wants to unravel that? So, the illusion survives, not because it's strong, but because it's emotionally protected. Even now, in a world of financial education, crypto assets, and liquidity culture, diamonds remain the outlier. Expensive to buy, impossible to sell, and yet still presented as investment. But let's be honest, a diamond isn't a store of value. It's a store of belief. Belief in romance, belief in ritual, belief that something shiny can hold your future. The brilliance isn't in the stone, it's in how convincingly the story was sold, and how few dare to question it. By now, you know the truth. The diamond isn't rare. It's not a reliable investment. It doesn't hold its value. It carries a legacy of manipulation, exploitation, and illusion. So why do people still buy them? Why does the ritual persist even when the mask has fallen? The answer lies not in the stone, but in the mirror. Because diamonds don't just say, "I love you." They say, "I made it. I'm worthy. I belong." In a world wired for performance, where identity is curated, filtered, shared, status has become the new currency. And diamonds are one of its most visible tokens. They shine, they're recognized, they're universal. Unlike crypto, vintage art, or generational land, you don't have to explain a diamond. It announces itself, silently, powerfully. This is why the logic doesn't matter. The resale value, the ethics, the science. Because the real transaction isn't financial. It's social. When someone proposes with a diamond, they're not just making a commitment. They're performing a script, one passed down through decades of advertising, cinema, tradition. To break that script is to risk being misunderstood, to disappoint, to seem cheap, or worse, to seem like you don't care. And that fear is potent. Because love, in its most vulnerable form, is fear-based. The fear of being alone, of being left, of not being enough. So we reach for symbols, not because they're true, but because they protect us. The diamond becomes armor against judgment, against comparison, against rejection. It's not about what the stone is, it's about what it says. I'm serious. I'm stable. I'm safe. And in this context, even a lab-grown diamond, cheaper, cleaner, identical, feels dangerous because it breaks the illusion. It says, I know the truth, and I'm still choosing you. But most people don't want truth. They want certainty, even if it's artificial. This is why the diamond endures, not because of what it is, but because of what we need it to be. A shortcut to significance, a ticket to belonging, a signal that says, I'm not alone. And if you strip all of that away, what remains? A gesture, a promise, a hope that something, somewhere will last forever, even if the world doesn't. Because in the end, we don't buy diamonds with our wallets, we buy them with our insecurities. And the industry knows that. They're not selling stones, they're selling reassurance. And we're still buying. Diamonds are for the many, but the truly wealthy, they've moved on. Because while the world was sold a story of eternal love, the elite, the discreet, the powerful, were building something else: quiet wealth. Real luxury isn't loud. It's not worn on the finger. It's not flaunted at weddings. It doesn't sparkle under showroom lights. It's invisible, protected, strategic. Ask a billionaire what they're buying, and you won't hear diamonds. You'll hear land, rare, untouched, permanent. Art with provenance, story, and value that grows in silence. Watches, vintage pieces with history, not hype. Wine, cellared treasures that speak in time, not volume. Knowledge, private mentorships, insider networks, rare intellectual capital. These are assets that appreciate, that whisper status, that belong to circles where public signals lose their power. Because in those rooms, diamonds are no longer impressive. They're assumed, expected, even a little obvious. True wealth doesn't need affirmation. And that's the irony. While the middle class stretches to buy the perfect engagement ring, saving, financing, sacrificing, the ultra-rich are avoiding the trap entirely. They know the rules because they helped write them. They see diamonds for what they are: a story, beautifully told, brilliantly sold, but ultimately just that, a story. They buy differently, not to show the world who they are, but to protect what they have. They don't chase forever. They invest in control. It's not about love. It's about leverage. And while the masses are sold eternity in a velvet box, the wealthy are securing generational power in quiet, unphotographed ways. Land deeds, private equity, Swiss accounts, heirlooms no one recognizes, but everyone envies. It's the luxury of invisibility. Because when you really have it, you don't need to prove it. And so, the diamond becomes a kind of costume, a beautiful, expensive costume worn by those still playing the game. But behind the curtain, the players have already moved on. They're not chasing sparkle, they're chasing sovereignty. And in their world, real wealth doesn't glitter. It doesn't dazzle. It doesn't need to. Real wealth whispers. It doesn't sparkle. You can still buy the diamond. You can still believe it means forever. You can still kneel, open the box, and feel the silence of tradition wrap itself around a single sparkle. No one will stop you. No one will judge you. Because most people still don't know. They don't know about the mines, the cartels, the ads written in boardrooms and disguised as romance. They don't know that the diamond's value was never in the stone, but in the story. And now, you do. You've seen behind the curtain. You've heard the silence between the slogans. You've traced the bloodline of a gem that was never meant to be questioned. And that changes everything. Because knowledge is a strange thing. It doesn't force you, it doesn't shout, it doesn't tell you what to do. It just sits quietly inside you and makes it impossible to see things the same way again. So maybe you'll still choose the diamond. Maybe you'll still follow the script. But it won't be blind. It'll be yours. That's the power of truth. It doesn't erase belief. It frees it. From manipulation, from expectation, from the quiet pressure to perform. And if you choose something else, a lab-grown stone, a different symbol, or nothing at all, it won't mean less. It might mean more. Because what matters isn't what you show, it's what you know. And now, you know. The choice is yours. Just remember, a diamond may be forever, but illusion never is.